everybody is give a little bit of background on the Americans with Disabilities Act, just because some people watching or participating might not know. It will seem very basic to all of you, I'm sure. I may touch on the fact that we're not totally there yet, that there's still work to do. And then I thought I would give, I have like a really nice thick bio on each of you. And I thought what I might do is kind of go in order, maybe read your entire kind of paragraph of biography that I have, and then let you talk for a little bit. And then like I would do Dr. Peterson first, and then let you chat for a bit. And then Dr. Petridis, is that right?
Yes.
Perfect. I'd have you talk next. Does that sound reasonable, or is that too formal? Do you want it to be more like a discussion? Let me do this. I will give your whole backgrounds, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Peterson first, and then we'll just kind of see where the conversation goes.
So you're introduced, and then do I go into my presentation, or
yes.
you want to introduce first and then go into presentations?
I'll do a little 5-minute talk, which will include your biographies.
I think Cheryl, you need to mute.
And then I will hand it to you.
Okay.
Okay, does that sound good? I'm really delighted to have all of you here. Need I mention that we're all women? And I'm ready to learn from you and hear how I can help as well. Does that sound good? Okay. All right, I think that, Wendy, I think we're ready to go. Hello, I'm Kim Schreier, representative from Washington's 8th Congressional District. I am just delighted to be here in a conversation with some very important, very wise people today, because this year is the 30th anniversary of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And right now we think back, we can't really even imagine a time when there could be discrimination based on ability. But it was really only 30 years ago that this changed. And I wanted to give a little background on that. Then I'll introduce my guests, and then we'll have a conversation about where we are now and where we can go next. So just as a reminder, the Americans with Disabilities Act became law in 1990. This is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life: schools, jobs, transportation, everything. And if you think about how many things we have today, buses that go lower, sign language interpreters that we just take for granted, those were not always there before 1990. And the purpose of this law is just to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. The ADA gives civil rights protections to people with disabilities similar to the ones based on race, color, religion. The one we're still working on is LGBTQ status. It guarantees equal opportunity in public accommodations, employment, transportation, state and local government services, and telecommunications. And so today, now that we are celebrating the 30th anniversary, I have some very special guests with me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, and then I will let them each give a presentation. So first, you will meet Dr. Naomi Jeffrey Peterson. She is a professor of curriculum, supervision, and educational leadership at Central Washington University. She delves into topics related to assessment and instruction, and also looks at the intersection of environment, culture, technology, and diverse applications. She also cultivated partnerships resulting in the launch of Central Washington's Interdisciplinary Accessibility Studies program, which she now directs. She is in Ellensburg. I also have Dr. Tara Lynn Petridis, who is an assistant professor in the World Languages and Cultures Department at Central Washington University. And one of those languages, American Sign Language. She is also the World Languages and Cultures ASL coordinator and advisor. She has taught ASL in higher learning institutions for the last 20 years. She also works with the Washington Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Youth, which is particularly important to me as a pediatrician, and mentors the parents of deaf and hard of hearing children ages 0 to 5. Deaf since 8 months old, Dr. Petridis uses ASL as a primary means of communication. She uses American Sign Language interpreters and captioning regularly. She lives with her spouse, and a sign language interpreter is present at all of her presentations. And you also function, I believe, as your spouse is a sign language interpreter in our public schools, which is so important. Our third guest is Dr. Cheryl Bergstaller, who founded and directs the Do It program. It's Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking and Technology Center and the Access Technology Center. This promotes the use of mainstream assisted technology and other interventions to support the success of students with disabilities in post-secondary education and careers. And this means altering things like computer labs, computer technology, and websites so that they are accessible to everyone. The ATC focuses efforts at the University of Washington, and the Do It Center reaches national and international audiences. So I am just delighted to welcome all three of you, and Christy, who is our sign language interpreter today. And I thought we would start with Dr. Peterson from Central Washington University Accessibility Studies to talk a little bit just about general awareness and the CWU program.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction. I'm sharing my screen so you have something more interesting to look at. And I will talk about all that in the context of pandemics and protests, because this is all about civil rights of people with disabilities. On the screen, you can see Ellensburg, which is where our campus is, and we have a combination of neoclassical and industrial brick architecture. However, most students are going to be navigating on screen this year. And this is creating a new normal that's quite welcome, because flexible hours and locations might be unremarkable in the future when people with which disabilities are served. Every student is a successful student, goes with CWU's commitment for student success. We support them to be in an inclusive environment, but also have success in their careers. However, there are many reasons that students struggle. So it's a continuous question. Do all students have access to education? We can thank the K-12 special education community for developing the first categories to look at special needs in terms of learning. The asterisks here indicate atypical neurological development. This is, of course, the average for children. Only 13% of students are expected to have disabilities and to be in special education, but the larger population is estimated at 20%. The workplace should expect increasing percentages of their employees as they age and they live their lives. Most disability is invisible, most affects learning, none of it is insurmountable. We look at ability in context. The most common problems are executive functions, soft skills, and fatigue. Vulnerability can come from personal characteristics like temporary or chronic disability, or conditions that marginalize you by those who are in more power. Or personal circumstances of abusive relationships or chronic poverty can affect your ability. Or it could be a widespread circumstance like the current pandemic. Increased anxiety is experienced by many people. So what does that look like in the classroom? And for that matter, what does it look like on the job? These are common problems, and what can we do about it? Equal treatment originally meant you had equal access, but you're on your own to cope. Individual accommodations allow more equitable and realistic access. But universal design removes systemic barriers that are both physical and social, like stigma. This is the new normal that we're hoping for. One strategy to meet the needs of university students is to have disability services. They consider the perspectives of the people involved and the best practices of instruction and the latest innovations and technologies so they can figure out what might help individual students with special needs to succeed. They identify the need, develop methods, and provide support. Similarly, in the workplace, human resources tend to respond to those needs. Another strategy is to strengthen capacity in the students. We know that autonomy, competence, and affiliation are necessary for self-regulation. It's also necessary for advocacy for themselves and for others in their careers and their personal lives. On a personal level, 100% of people will experience some disability in their lives, whether temporary, intermittent, or chronic, and likely so will someone in their families. Also, 100% of their careers will either serve people with disabilities, employ colleagues with disabilities, or market products needed by this population. They need to learn the accessibility knowledge base and be part of an inclusive society. Accessibility studies offers the tools for autonomy, competence, and affiliation. Other programs focus on some other important dimensions of this complex issue, but ours is simply the knowledge base that everyone in any career needs to know. So we provide the professional certificate and undergraduate minor that started 3 years ago, and this year we're offering graduate certificate or a specialization within another graduate program. Our focus is not on rehabilitation and individual accommodation, but on high incidence variations in ability and principles of universal design, wellness, and social justice. In the Wildcat tradition of experiential learning, we would walk the talk of being accessible ourselves as we promote accessibility and be online. But we have to acknowledge the long legacy that led to the development of these two programs. And today we celebrate the 30th anniversary, as Kim mentioned. But an early influence was the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And over 50 years later, the UN convened on the rights of persons with disabilities. Sadly, the US has still not signed this. Now, the watershed issue in our own country was the Civil Rights Act. This did not occur based on quiet debate, but was prompted by widespread unrest demanding that the complacent and privileged come to terms with racial and economic inequity. This is a century after emancipation from the World War, and we'll see that as a pattern. There's often a lag behind one action and behind some actual implementation. Sometimes the protest is not one of antagonism, but embarrassment. In 1957, Hugo Defner was to be honored by now the cringeworthy title of being Handicapped Person of the Year, Handicapped American of the Year. However, moments before he was supposed to receive the award, it became apparent he simply couldn't get in the building. This prompted the Eisenhower administration to promote standards for buildings. And a decade later, the 1968 Architectural Barriers Act limited just to federal buildings and those built with federal monies, but it set the stage for further progress. There have been some other refinements, including in 2017, standards for medical diagnostic equipment that everybody should have the right to access. But the Americans with Disabilities Act did not come without protest. Widespread demonstrations brought it to light that there are problems with access. They literally crawled up the steps of the Capitol to make the point. Notice the "fix the system, not me" sign. That's in the spirit of viewing disabilities as a mismatch with the environment and traditional attitudes rather than a matter of having something wrong. It was the start of a trend toward thinking of disability on a continuum and as part of one's identity, rather than merely a puzzle to solve or an inconvenience to prevent. A century before, there had been ugly laws that forbade unsightly beggars and simply forced people who were considered disfigured or abnormal to hide. The traditional shame and fear of pity was beginning to be replaced by advocacy. Something else was developing. A few years later, the Rehabilitation Act was passed in 1973 that focused not on physical access to buildings, but the right to work and funding for services and research. However, in 1977, Section 504 still had not been enacted, and, a protest emerged. Large groups of people displayed the difficulty, again, of access, and they interrupted traffic and government offices. The sign here said, "Asking did not work." A decade later, another section was, I don't know what, I'm getting some feedback on my, I don't know if that's affecting you, but I got some feedback there.
Yeah, let's have everybody mute if they're not speaking.
Section 508 was added a decade later, which is about communication, especially technology. And we now have Policy 188 in Washington State, which requires all state agencies and their vendors to have an accessibility plan and an accessibility coordinator. Let's not forget another parallel history. A decade before the Civil Rights Act, the Supreme Court case of Brown v. Topeka determined that schools cannot segregate based on race, and that signaled the beginning at the end of exclusion. This picture from 1961 confirms that even though something is legislated or adjudicated, common practice tends to resist giving up old prejudices and privileges. Thus, further protests appear necessary to demand justice. The 1965 Elementary and Education Act was a companion legislation. It's worthy of note. A decade later, the Education for All Handicapped Children, or 94-142, developed from the precedent of the Rehabilitation Act, which required access to school. It has since been updated, addressing such needs as the involvement of parent. Now, IEPs may have 504 plans if the disability is temporary, like a broken arm, and doesn't meet the criteria of special needs. We now have a generation of students accustomed to the presence of minority faces and voices. Let's consider the main differences between the significant legislation packages. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, with its sections 504 and 508, and the American Disabilities Act, focused on universal design of facilities and set the legal precedent for policy guidelines. These are civil rights acts that serve the purpose of risk management, that is, avoiding injuries and avoiding lawsuits. The special education legislation instead is an appropriations bill. So it provides federally funded advocates for children in schools. Its focus is on individual accommodations, and its success is measured by individual academic achievement in the least restrictive environment. Thus, IDEA provides funding and oversight to make sure the civil rights of the children are met. Some grants might be involved, but for the most part, ADA and 504 and 508 only provide legal grounds to win a complaint or a grievance. The Accessibility Studies program at Central Washington University is the result. This is the common knowledge that we know from IDEA, and each course provides something personally and professionally meaningful, like the competence to recognize where, when, and how to include people with varying degrees of ability, especially regarding issues of stigma. Universal design addresses ADA compliance and the principle that designing something well for vulnerable populations results in a better design for everyone. Accessible information design focuses on the web accessibility guidelines for better communication with both online persons and online. Finally, the capstone project applies the knowledge base of the 3 core classes to a real-world environment, resulting in an analytical report with practical recommendations. For example, Chelsea Rivas studied the important condition of children who are, for instance, in motorized wheelchairs, having to evacuate a building in case of an emergency. But how to do that when elevators are automatically suspended. Conscious of our time here, so these are just more examples of the undergraduate research that I'm so proud of. And we obviously need more advocacy, awareness, and acceptance to bridge this gap. So you can speak for yourself and you can speak for others. It's complex and it requires a lot of integration of thinking. The vulnerable populations have to be heard and studied. And we're going to hear from Dr. Patrice on that regard. Wellness and social justice have to be incorporated in all curricula, and the technology has to be advanced. We'll hear from Cheryl about that. And the synergy is exciting. All sorts of programs now, at least at our campus, are incorporating accessibility studies within their curricula. And we're even starting a club. And fun new classes are happening, media portrayals of disability. And with that, my friends, I will end this show and thank you very much. And stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson. You highlighted some really important things there. I think one, in this moment when we are all standing together to advocate for an equal justice system, you reminded us that it shouldn't just be Black people fighting for Black justice. It shouldn't just be people with disabilities fighting for people with disabilities, and that all of us who know that we can do better need to do better. It also occurred to me when you were talking that my office building in Washington, D.C., as far as I know, has exactly one entrance that is adapted with a ramp. And I am thinking about what would happen and how a person could evacuate my particular building. And I might be mistaken, but I think Congress passed some kind of rule excluding them from these requirements. So I think it's time for me to go back and have that conversation. And the third thing I think was really, I mean, everything you said was really interesting, but these are things that jumped out to me was that at the very beginning, you talked about how we are all experiencing adaptive situations right now, that when we are dealing with coronavirus, we're now adapting to work from home and rely on technology and hope that our microphones work and that we're getting a little bit of a taste for what it's like to not necessarily have your bearings. So I just really appreciate your comments. And you already said who's speaking next, but Dr. Teralyn Petrides is going to talk with us next about the ASL program and how students at Central Washington University who are deaf or hard of hearing communicate and those kind of adaptations. So thank you, Dr. Petrides. The stage is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I really would like to talk about Central Washington University, but I also would like to address just the general challenges that deaf people have gone through and how the ADA made such a dramatic change for the deaf community. And I will also address what type of changes I'd like to see happen in the future. As a deaf person, I feel that I can give some vision to other people when it comes to what's needed for accessibility, and I can explain a little bit more about why that is. I remember when I was growing up, a deaf child, I remember the access for me wasn't there. I'd go to summer school. I went to a public hearing school, and they didn't have an interpreter in the classroom. So I'd always find myself off in the corner reading a book, but I could see that the teacher was chatting with my fellow students and they'd be laughing, but it passed me by. And I have many friends who are also deaf, and we always loved watching movies, but if you think about what we might have loved, it was horror. And that's because it was the only type of movie we could really understand without the captioning. It wasn't as necessary to have those stories, but now there's captioning, and I can't even stand to watch a horror movie anymore. Now I enjoy many other genres, and it's because of that accessibility that's been given since the ADA. I remember the day that President Bush signed that into law. Hold on a sec, I have a little light that I need to adjust here. Can you guys hear the interpreter? Are you guys able? I had some sort of light and I thought maybe there was a sound issue.
Yes, I can hear Christy perfectly.
Okay, great. So slowly we saw these changes come into play over the last 30 years. But even over the last 10 years, I've seen amazing development within the community and all around our nation. People are recognizing the need for change. People are working together, educating each other, and seeing the importance of access. More and more, I'm seeing online courses with captions and much better access as a whole. Deaf and hard of hearing people can now access education in an entirely different way. Also, we have interpreters in the community, in the classroom, in the education field. We have video relay service interpreters. Before, deaf people had to type their messages on a TTY if they wanted to have a phone conversation. Now they can communicate live through an interpreter. And now we're seeing the use of certified deaf interpreters. I'm sure recently, if you've watched any of the Washington State news briefs, you'll see that there's a deaf interpreter right next to the governor as they share their information. And that's a certified deaf interpreter. They're working with a hearing interpreter who feeds them the information, and they translate people are coming as a community and looking at access and valuing its importance. Something that we need to understand is quality, though. When you're looking at K through 12 education, it's getting better and better for those students with their interpreter and the quality. But there's different types of training, and better training results that's what we're looking for. So let me expand upon that. At Central, I've proposed a bachelor's degree program, Deaf and Sign Language Studies, which is the first in Washington State. And I hope to expand that soon because I hear from people all the time that interpreters need support. The ADA minimum people are working on having that, but we really need to refocus our energies, and rather than just looking at the minimum, we need to be looking at quality, which provides full access. Quality is important. Let me share a little bit of information with you about that. We need to see more high quality qualified interpreters. Based on information I received from CDHY, the Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Youth in Washington State, we have 4,000 deaf and hard of hearing students. These students are using interpreters in our public schools. We're still struggling, though, to provide them with qualified interpreters. If you look at a sample of about 120 to 130 educational interpreters, you'll find that many of them are below state standard for their EIPA performance skills. It's recommended in Washington that they get a 3.5, but it's not being enforced. Ultimately, what would be ideal is a 4.0 if you want those deaf and hard of hearing students to have access. In Washington State right now, we're not there. The legislation that we have doesn't have teeth. And though we have proposed different bills, it's not, we just don't have a timeline set up that's clear. If they will take the test and not pass, but there's no clarity over when they have to meet the standard in order to keep their jobs. Some states are already at a 4.0. And a nationally certified interpreter needs to have a BA degree. And, so there's having that acceptable score is very important. And we need to ask Washington State for their support to put teeth in the legislation that we have for those educational interpreters to provide full access to the students in K-12. And we need to make sure that there's a timeline on them meeting those standards. With the COVID pandemic right now, we're seeing that some interpreters are working with deaf students and they're connecting online with these students, and you can tell the students are not able to stay focused on the interpreter. Clearly there's the interpreter, if you're dealing with a struggle and then an interpreter that's not qualified, and the district doesn't really have the knowledge not to hire them. So setting up some more rigorous guidelines for these districts and interpreters to follow is really important. And CDHY is working towards that goal. I believe we need to expand our interpreter training programs. House Bill 1623, unfortunately, stopped in the House at the committee level for 2 years in a row. But the hope is that we'd like to see more support and funding for higher educational institutions to be able to provide those trainings, and not just at Central Washington University, but also in Eastern Washington and Western Washington. Because there are interpreters out there who are working that need to improve, and there are students that want to move into the profession that need proper preparation, and they want to be able to either meet that standard on the EIPA or pass that national level test. So we really need to collaborate to make these things happen. So this is a big day to celebrate the ADA, but it's also a day to recognize that we don't want to accept the minimum. We want to look for quality and effectiveness and full accessibility. Not just accessibility in buildings, but accessibility in quality communication and interpretation services for deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind consumers. So as we learn about the process, focusing on quality and collaborating with people who have a strong background and experience will be beneficial. As I look towards the next 30 years, or really things are changing so fast, maybe we should keep it focused on the next 5 years. I see us working together at the local, state, and even the national level just to continue to move things forward and bring things up to the quality that we need for maximum accessibility. I know that because of access, I can do my best work with my job. I can offer workshops. I can open up trainings. I can be part of the faculty experience. I was department chair at a different university, and accessibility was so important to work with a high quality interpreter. That's what leads us to being able to do what we need to do. And it's inspirational. And it allows those children in the future to look up and see what happens when people have access. There's so many different roles, and children need to be able to have role models to look up to within their community. We have to work together to make it happen. Thank you guys so much for your time.
Dr. Petrides, that was a fantastic presentation, and I just want to thank you for shedding light. And I can see that your husband, who is a school interpreter, is probably phenomenal having these discussions with you all the time, and I'll bet you look at him and then recognize what level all of your students should rise to. I have a quick question for you, which is, I'm thinking about, I believe you said 4,000 students in Washington State are deaf or hard of hearing. It's hard to imagine that each...
In the K-12 setting.
In the yes, thank you for clarifying. In the K-12 setting, I was wondering what proportion of those 4,000 have an American Sign Language interpreter in the classroom versus another modality like cochlear implant, lip reading, or another assistance device.
I can't give you a specific percent, but I do know that the interpreters work with these students, even those students that have cochlear implants and are oral also many times have interpreters. So it's really interesting, or it's important to really offer as many ways for access as possible, even if they do have a cochlear implant, even if they are reading lips, that having that ASL interpretation is a benefit. Today, especially with people using masks for COVID, that really is a hindrance for those people who only read lips. So offering all modalities for those children, it's a huge benefit. I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
That does answer my question, especially because as soon as I said the word lip reading, I knew right away that that would be impossible in a classroom where a teacher has to turn to look at the board and you can't constantly read his or her lips. So thank you. Thank you for supporting children as well. I know that many, if not all, of my patients who were hearing impaired went to a center in Seattle that you probably helped establish so that they could learn to thrive and their parents could learn sign language. And I'm just very grateful for that help for them. Our next guest is Dr. Cheryl Bergstaller from University of Washington to talk to us a little bit about adaptive technology and modifications that can be made to help people with disabilities. So the floor is yours, Dr. Bergstaller.
Well, thank you for including me. I'm here to talk a little bit about IT. We've talked about a lot of IT already. It's really clear that technology plays a big role in all that we do, and particularly making things accessible. But technology is really good about blocking accessibility for some people too. And so that's what I'm going to share and talk a little bit about online learning in particular, since we're doing so much of that in the middle of the pandemic. So I'm Cheryl Bergstaller. I do work at the University of Washington. I direct Accessible Technology Services, which is part of UWIT. And I can be reached at sherylb@uw.edu. So feel free to contact me at any time. So I'm going to go back in history before the ADA, what things were like in IT. And this goes back a while before the ADA. In my first experiences with assistive technology. And that goes back to 1980. So what were things like then? Some of you are old enough to remember the Apple II computer. Well, it was a dynamite machine in K-12 at that time. And I ran into a young man who's quadriplegic, still am connected with him. He's 6 years old, and his special education teacher introduced me to him. He had no use of his hands or his legs, and he used what he called a mouth wand or a stylist to type on a keyboard and a typewriter, and his special ed teacher wondered if he could use a computer. And I said, well, I think he probably could, and wanted to meet this young man. And so I found out very quickly that there were issues, and the major issue was because he could not press two keys at the same time, because he's basically a one-finger typer, so to speak, we needed to find a way for him to lock one of those keys and so that he could press the second one. And I had to go all the way to the University of Michigan to find somebody that might figure out how to do this for me, and sent me a diagram with a box that you could build. It has a picture on this picture on the screen here, a box you could build that would have 3 switches on it that could lock those 3 keys. And so that solved the problem. So Rodney, this young man, could take this switch box and lock the shift key and the control key and the repeat keys, and then press another key. So this was kind of a big deal. It was pretty exciting. I had actually contacted Apple and asked them for help, and they said, well, we don't do that kind of stuff. Like they were just confused that I'd ask about accessibility to someone who couldn't use their keyboard, and seemed like they didn't think that that was really their problem. Well, that is assistive technology. My first experience with assistive technology, and back in the day, assistive technology was developed and implemented in the garages and the back rooms of engineers, sometimes motivated by children that they knew or a spouse or someone who needed access to a computer. Well, things have changed dramatically since then. There are thousands of assistive devices, and a lot of things are built in. The three keys to lock those now is actually a software thing, and it's called sticky keys. And it'd be hard to find a computer that doesn't have sticky keys as a software solution. So today what we expect is IT and will build in accessibility features. And you need to look no further than your smartphone to realize how many features you have where you can turn the background and the text, reverse the colors in the screen. You can enlarge the characters. You can speak to your phone. Your phone will speak back to you. In fact, my phone tends to speak a little too much. I can hardly get it to shut up. But anyway, so there are a lot of features that are just built into mainstream technology. And that's a good thing. Things that would have been assistive technology not that many years ago, but certainly before the ADA. And then you want to make sure that your system ensures compatibility with assistive technology. For instance, if someone is using a Braille embosser to produce materials in Braille, we don't want to include that Braille embosser on all of our iPhones just because somebody might want to use it. That's a good role for assistive technology for a specific person, but it requires that our mainstream IT be compatible with it so that person who needs to use that embosser can actually use it with the mainstream technology. Now, what we're talking about when we build in features like this is a concept called universal design. The definition of universal design by the Center on Universal Design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So I don't have to go find some engineer to build a little box for me to make my computer work for someone who can't use the keyboard. That many things will just be built in, and when they're not totally built in, there is assistive technology that can do the rest of the access. And so that's a basic idea. The most common application of universal design is curb cuts. Back in the 70s, I'm sure a lot of people wondered how we'd ever make a commitment, especially at the University of Washington, to have curb cuts in all of our sidewalks so people in wheelchairs could get up and down from the sidewalk. Well, now we don't think that that's an unusual thing. It took a lot of work to retrofit those sidewalks, but today we just build them in and we expect them. And when we're pushing a baby carriage down the street, we expect that we can get off that curb or onto the curb easily. And so it benefits everyone. Now, with respect to IT, we can actually look to the Department of Justice and the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights for a definition of what we mean by accessible IT. What does that mean? Well, it's very clear. It means that a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner, with substantially equivalent ease of use. The person with a disability must be able to obtain the information as fully, equally, and independently as a person without a disability. You know, to me, that's very clear. Some people find it kind of frustrating that it doesn't talk about IT. It doesn't talk about, well, you know, what does that mean as far as your website or other IT? Well, when we look at the ADA, which has been clear from the other speakers, is civil rights legislation. ADA doesn't mention IT. It basically says whatever you're doing, using IT or using whatever, you need to make it accessible to people with disabilities, something that you're making available to other people, like an online class. If you're teaching an online class and you're making it available to anybody who wants to join, then a person who requires accessible content should be able to join. And so that's the ADA. And some people are frustrated with that because they want it to be more specific. Well, I actually like the idea that it's civil rights. Just like for women and racial ethnic minorities and other groups protected by law, it basically says individuals with disabilities have a right to the things that we're offering using IT or in person or whatever. So another thing that happened in the very same year is the World Wide Web. And so the ADA was actually developed and published before there was even a World Wide Web. And the person who developed the web has this statement to say about it. The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. And this is the World Wide Web Consortium's view of the World Wide Web. Right from day one, accessibility was considered an important factor. It wasn't until 1999, though, until this consortium came up with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so those guidelines help guide us, make these websites and other technology, for that matter, accessible to people with disabilities. And it continues to be updated as time goes on. But now, if we take a look at online learning, there are two IT accommodations that are quite expensive and often offered. One of them, making inaccessible documents accessible, mainly reformatting PDF files. Universal design would say, why are we making these inaccessible documents? Let's make accessible documents from the get-go, born accessible, and use them in our classes, and we wouldn't need that accommodation anymore. The second one is captioning videos. Why don't we capture our videos, and why don't we capture them accurately? So we no longer have to have a captioning of a video as an accommodation. So you can see I'm really pushing this agenda of universal design throughout. We created a document as part of one of our projects called Access Cyber Learning, and it's called 20 Tips for Making an Accessible Online Course. And it includes about half of those tips for making the web pages accessible, designing these PDFs and other documents to be accessible, providing alternative text for images for people that can't see them, and so forth, captioning videos. And so they're in that document. And then there are about the other half of the tips are about instructional methods. Faculty members can make their content consistent from page to page, give good instructions, be really articulate, and giving those instructions for assignments ahead of time so students have time to plan their quarter, whatever the term is, to get their assignments done. And so a lot of it is just about good teaching. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that document. If you search by 20 tips on the website, on the web, you'll find it eventually. But that's how you can make your instructional methods accessible. And it includes references for how to do these things. You know, how do you edit a YouTube video, captions to make them accurate, things like that. So take a look at that. So what do we need? This is just to conclude, where are we? You know, is it done now? We've got all this stuff going. We've got standards, we've got principles, we have lots of IT. So what's the problem? Well, we need to increase the knowledge and skills of designers and teachers and researchers. Most online designers and teachers do not employ universal design practices. Some will apply a few practices and some not. This means that students with disabilities have to rely on after-the-fact accommodations, and that's just not fair. They should have the same access of other students as other students, and sure, we'll need accommodations, but we shouldn't be using so many accommodations because the courses should just be born accessible. Researchers as well don't necessarily apply universal design. So we should adopt a universal design approach in the design of the IT. So our learning management systems are pretty good at having accessibility features in them, but a lot of add-ons that we use do not employ those types of features. And the resources we use, like the websites and the teaching methods we use, should apply universal design. And we need to address accessibility issues in research. That project I told you about, Access Cyber Learning, we've worked forth over 100 projects designing the next generation of digital technology. How much of it do you think is from the get-go accessible to students with disabilities? Most of it is not, and we're trying to change that situation. And then we need to increase the capabilities of assistive technology. What if assistive technology could just be a lot smarter, using artificial intelligence, that it could figure out if a document's not accessible and just plain fix it? That would be cool. And I think there's a long way we can go in making assistive technology more capable of doing some of those things that now human beings do. So if you want more information about this, and if you want to find that 20 tips document, go to uw.edu/DOIT/accessDL. Another website that we have at the university on IT accessibility, uw.edu/accessibility. And you'll find the 20 tips document at either place. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Burgstaller. That was really fantastic. And I will look up the 20 tips. And I could not agree more about just designing things to make them universally accessible from the get-go. It just seems like common sense, and I very much appreciate that perspective. I will conclude with just a couple remarks. First, I want to thank all of you for joining me, and I want to extend a special thank you to Christy Camarada, our ASL interpreter, who has done the interpretation back and forth for us in this conversation. But I've had some recent conversations just in my own life that have really been eye-opening to the need for some of the issues that are really top of mind right now. I had a phone call with a friend whose son has Down syndrome and is now 18 years old. And she was remarking about how helpful it was to have the ability to vote from home, that they could sit down together, they could go through the ballot, they could look up information online, really research thoroughly and take their time. And he was able to make informed decisions and vote. And she was very grateful for that opportunity and wishes that we, for a variety of reasons, can vote safely from home. The other has been discussions about the census and how they've really, census.gov has really gone to some lengths to make sure that there are so many ways to complete the census, that you can do it by phone, online, with paper, people will come to your house. And I thought that was really important. And then the third is, of course, just the way that we are all working from home right now. And hopefully that's giving us all a little bit of perspective. So I wanted to thank all of you for joining me and for your dedication to standing up for people who do have disabilities and need adaptations, and how forward thinking you are. And you have given me a lot of food for thought during this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.